Wanted to give you an update on a huge break in a case that, was basically a cold case for more than 10 years. This is the Gilgo Beach serial killer. Police say that they have caught and apprehended the man. Let's go ahead and put up on the screen what we know about him, and then I'll give you a little bit of the backstory here. The man they've identified and arrested is Rex Heuermann. They say he is a suspect in Gilgo Beach killings, led a life of chaos and control. He was painstaking in his Manhattan professional pursuits, but at home in Massapequa Park, he left neighbors discomfited. So they paint a portrait in the New York Times of a man who was an architectural consultant, worked with, some well-known entities. His professional reputation was that he was very fastidious, almost over-the-top attention to detail, which some of his clients apparently appreciated, and some of them he was, sort of irritated them, the level of attention to detail and obsessive focus that he had. But interestingly, his neighbors really had a very different feeling about him and tried to avoid him and gave him the creeps, for lack of a better term. One neighbor, Mr. Furchaw, said, "I was not surprised at all when he was arrested because of all the creepiness." Mr. Furchaw recounted several run-ins with his neighbor, none pleasant. There was the time he said hello to him as he was cutting wood, and Mr. Heuermann responded by silently glaring back between chops of his splitting maul. Another neighbor who has lived in that neighborhood for 10 years has a friend who lives behind Mr. Heuermann. Sometimes Mr. Schmidt would visit his buddy, have a few beers in the backyard, look out at the sagging Heuermann house and say, he probably has bodies there. So obviously giving off some really weird vibes. There was another instance where that same neighbor, Mr. Schmidt, and his friend resolved to take their kids trick-or-treating at his house just to get a look inside. They were surprised when Mr. Heuermann answered the door, gave each child a small plastic pumpkin, but when they got home, Mr. Schmidt's wife was like, "There is no way in hell you're letting our children eat that candy based on who it came from," and threw it in the trash. Made him throw it in the trash. It's also a weird incident where he stole oranges from a Whole Foods that were meant for kids. So anyway, there was a really mixed picture of this guy, I guess, consistent with the idea that he was really living and leading two lives. He was married. He has one report I saw said one child, another said two children. His daughter worked with him at the architectural firm. He was arrested, outside of that firm. But part of what makes this, something that we wanted to go into here is that this case was basically dead, and this was horrific. We're talking about 10 years ago, roughly, more than 10 years ago, they found 4 bodies. Then they started to really, look more extensively, and they found remains of up to 16 different people in this area near Gilgo Beach. Put the next piece up on the screen. But there was a huge corruption issue in the local, among the local police officers. And so they didn't want to work with the FBI because the head dude was actually under investigation by the FBI for corruption, for the fact that he beat up some suspect and then got everybody to cover it up and lie about it, et cetera. So he didn't want to work with the FBI, so he let the case drop. And so it didn't come back up and get close to any sort of conclusion until they brought in a new police chief. There was also another element here where, because the women who were brutally murdered and their bodies left in this area of the beach, they were mostly, they were escorts on Craigslist. And they had moved to New York from other areas. And so they were seen as sort of not that important, and became not that high a priority for the people who were involved. So it was, a really horrifying look at who people actually care about and who they thought mattered. So this new police chief comes in, decides, because there's new technology related to DNA evidence, that maybe she could have another crack at solving this case and being able to bring to justice this Long Island serial killer. Also, this woman really had an understanding of how much, even if the news is horrible and families find out that, yes, this was my daughter and yes, this was her killer, that sort of revelation can at least bring some closure to the family. So she was really committed to that, and ultimately is able to sort of break this case open. There was a pizza crust and DNA evidence that was involved, and matching his truck with a truck that was seen at one of the scenes of the crime. And they were able to bring the alleged killer to justice.
Yeah, this is one of the craziest things that I've read in terms of the serial killer kind of discourse. I think that the worst part about it, as you said, Crystal, was that it was a cold case for so many years, which really does, if they're able to catch them also based on old witness testimony and doing the basic groundwork of looking at car registration and then eventually obtaining DNA, I mean, presumably all of that existed a decade ago. So don't the police really have a lot to answer for here
Oh, yeah.
as to why? I mean, look, if it was development of a technology that didn't, exist a year, okay, fine. But, world wasn't that different in 2012. Like, it's like whenever we saw a witness statement and then they were checking car registration records, if anything, they would have been current at the time rather than having to go retrospect. It's not like DNA also didn't exist also. And then I always am of two minds whenever I think about neighbors and witnesses and all this. Because on the one hand, like, I've got some weird neighbors. That doesn't mean you're a serial killer. But, if somebody is joking about bodies in a basement and then also making people throw candy away, and then you have multiple instances also of, the report, Crystal, that his interior designer said that he had a chamber inside of his basement that he wouldn't let anybody go into. I mean, that is where things get sketchy to the point of you probably should alert somebody. At the same time, like, look, there's always an innocent explanation. He said it was for guns. I know gun people who've got gun rooms. I guess they wouldn't let a lot of people into them. So, maybe that's what they were just willing to brush it off. But I think the fact that you had to bring in a new police chief after a decade to really just do some very basic legwork here is really an awful look for this area. And you got to think about too the victims. This is very common, unfortunately, in a lot of these serial killer cases. Is they just target the underclass, people like prostitutes and escorts and others. Nobody's gonna miss them. A lot of them are runaways. They're not as much of a high priority. They don't have their family members beating down the door in order to get their cases solved. And they're the ones who are victimized the worst. I mean, we sometimes as a society pay attention to them really whenever they get killed. But just if these are really just the outliers, there's a lot of them who get raped or mistreated or terribly abused literally on a day-to-day basis, and nobody ever really looks or even cares about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you had some people who were involved in this case who basically outright said, like, oh, well, we're lucky that it was no one who really mattered. I mean, it was horrific, some of the things that they said and the attitude towards this case because of who these women were. But these women were a lot more than just, an escort to be discarded with. These were mothers, these were daughters, these were people who had hopes and dreams and aspirations and were maybe struggling at that particular point in time in their life, but they were human beings who really mattered. So there's that piece of it. There's the part of like who society cares about and who these police cared about to actually try to identify their killers. And think about all these years that went by. Like, we don't know that this maniac, this bloodthirsty killer wasn't continuing to murder girls during this time. So there's also the piece of like, you could have saved lives if you had gone aggressively after this and actually tried to, to close this case. Let me just tell you, because the other piece about the corruption aspect of this really speaks to an abuse of power and like a power trip piece too. So here's the details. They say that the former chief of the police department in Suffolk County, who was the one that had the corruption issues, his name was James Burke. And he was the one who really sort of let this case drop because he didn't want to work with the FBI. The reason was the Justice Department was investigating him for corruption. In late 2012, a year after assuming control of the Suffolk police, Mr. Burke assaulted a man who was being held for a parole violation. The parolee, whose name is Christopher Loeb, had been brought on suspicion that he had stolen a bag from the police chief's car that contained pornography and sex toys. Mr. Burke then pressured detectives who saw him beat this man deny that they saw the attack. Even the Suffolk County District Attorney, Thomas Spoda, helped with that cover-up. Eventually, both of them were convicted of conspiracy, and Suffolk County became notorious as one of the nation's most corrupt law enforcement jurisdictions. So the other piece of this is, these guys who felt like the rules didn't apply to them. They felt like they were the law. They thought that they could abuse their power and engage in a cover-up and get away with that. The fact that they had their own personal issues of corruption is part of why they did not aggressively look to, to solve this case and just let it linger for years and years while vulnerable women continued to be at risk.
Yeah, and I think that's why the public is involved in it. It's not, it's not always grisly details, and they're always so interested. It's always just a question of how does something like this happen? It really is a tragedy, and yeah, I'm glad that we actually spent some time on these because, sometimes people, and I see this all, the Daily Mail and all these people are having a field day in terms of like, oh, like I said, interior designer. Guess what? I read it. I had to. I had to know. But we're trying to think about this from a systemic level of like police screwed this up, the people who were responsible for protecting, and then also people who are the most vulnerable amongst us in our society very often just get disregarded. And then when they get killed, nobody takes a notice. That's why the case is allowed to languish for a decade when apparently it really wasn't that difficult to solve. And who knows, maybe somebody else could have been saved. Apparently they're still pulling bodies and remnants and all those things out of his residence. So it's really gross. It's very sad.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.